Thank you very much to both of you, and also thank you to Polygon that is hosting us here today. And what is our schedule for today? During the first part, we are going to listen to 3 keynote speakers on the past, present, and future of jobs, work, labor, to somehow grasp the history of idea and also coordinates of contemporary position. In the second part, we host discussion panel. What about the future of workers in Europe, with international guests? And at that time, you will be also invited to prepare and ask questions. And we also have the third part of the conference, which will be open floor for you in the first part of Polygon after the event. So let's start the journey. Back to history first. So how did we arrive at the point where we are now? I would like to invite Karl Heinz Paque to uncover the economic history of the job for us. Mr. Paque is chair of international economics at the Otto von Guericke University of Magdeburg, dean of the Faculty of Economics, and also former Minister of Finance of the state of Saxony-Anhalt. And as we already heard, he's also vice president of Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom. Welcome.
Dear Felicita, dear Sebastian, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here in this old tobacco factory, which is really fits very nicely to the kind of bird's eye view I'm going to take with respect to the development of jobs, the character of jobs in modern societies. When I read the title, when Sebastian called me up in Magdeburg and asked whether I would come, I didn't have the exact notion of the title of my talk yet. And then when I got it, I was really impressed hearing that I should talk about an economic history of the job. Then I thought I could start at Paleolithic ages and talk about hunters and gatherers. This is how it all started. Well, I won't do this, although it would be an interesting exercise. And in my university, in my economic history class, I do it, in fact, but not in one half an hour that I have the time to use up here. What I will do, however, is start from the heyday of industrial society, which is roughly 40, 50 years ago, 1-2 generations ago. More two than one, and look at what has changed and what is likely to change and what can we do to shape this world. And that is then open to the further discussion that we will have. Well, I look at Europe in particular, because that's the place where we live. And the heyday of industrial society, when you date it, it's roughly the time after the Second World War, from 1950 to the mid-1970s. Notably, the year 1973 is an extremely important year in economic history. I come to that point in a minute. Up to that time, there was an extremely fast trade integration, a fast productivity growth, still a genuine growth of industry, notably in my country, in Germany, after the wartime destruction and the bad interwar years. There was a peak of union power. There was, politically speaking, a peak of social democracy, social democratic parties. There was a peak of collective bargaining, the wage setting of employers' associations and unions, and there was generally very low unemployment, and there was fast wage growth, and there was a trend towards more equality in society, which a French economist, Thomas Piketty, recently took in a book which became a bestseller, as to show that these were the the good old times, and we are living now in the bad times. Well, the heyday of industrial society was, of course, as everything in history, non-sustainable. Nothing in this world goes on forever. And it's a very young, we are a very young audience here, which I very much like. But for those who are a bit older, may remember that in these early period, or they may have learned from history books, in the Eastern, Central and Eastern Europe, a part of Europe, there was a planned economy, a centrally planned economy. And this centrally planned economy did never really work well. But at that time, it did not work so badly because it could mimic, if you like, the industrial world that was out there in the market-oriented capitalism, if you like. But that changed dramatically in the early 1970s with the oil price crisis. The first hike of raw material prices, oil prices in the world economy, which happened in 1973-4, and a couple of years later in a second big wave in the late 1970s and early 80s. That hit industry dramatically hard. There was all over Europe, notably in my country, all over Western Europe, I must say, there was a massive shrinkage of industry, and it turned out to be so forever. We didn't think that yet, but it was forever. I'm 58 years old. I still remember that year in 1973, because that was a shock to us all, that growth did not just go on as we had learned it before. And at the same time, a new generation of young people, the baby boomer generation, was entering the labor market, adding a massively high number of young people searching for jobs to those who had turned unemployed by the industrial crisis. It began a time of chronic unemployment, which was recognized in the West as an awful crisis. Many intellectuals, I remember that, at that time, looked almost with envy to Central and Eastern Europe, because the planned economy did not allow unemployment to emerge. However, as in personal life, a crisis is always an opportunity. I'm sometimes kidding a little bit or exaggerating a little bit and saying a person who never has a crisis is absolutely boring, because to advance in your life, to learn something, you have to find out that some things, some paths that you take, don't work if you just continue as you did in the past. And it's the same with economies. And that was the big tragedy of the Central and Eastern European countries with their planned economies, that they did not realize the kind of structural change that was necessary. They postponed the structural change, and that was disastrous, as we all know, after when the wall came down and the Iron Curtain fell in Europe in 1989, 1990. In the western part of the world, however, we had two new phenomena, as I said. In Europe, we had chronically high unemployment and chronically high long-term unemployment. And in the United States, where we have more flexible wages, a greater wage differentiation, we began to have a kind of split society. The word working poor came up at this time in the United States. So there were different answers, but basically to the same question. Then came the next period, after 1990. As you all know, this is the time of the market, the big transformation in Central and Eastern Europe, the countries which began to join the world economy, and that had massive effects on the jobs in countries like Slovenia and all the rest of it, of Eastern Europe. Because the postponed structural crisis, that had happened continuously in the West came down on the Eastern European and Central European countries with one big stroke, which was much worse socially, psychologically, than the more gradual adjustment and crisis that had taken place in the West. I know also what I'm talking about. I live in Eastern Germany, and Magdeburg, the city where I live, Eastern Germany was part of the centrally planned economic Eastern Soviet-dominated space, and the crisis, the industrial crisis at that time was massive. Well, again, now, as you know, in your countries, in the Central European countries, unemployment rose, high emigration began to develop to Western Europe, to where the crisis had been more or less overcome by the 1990s. By and large, this transformation, one can say today, especially in the Central European countries and also in Slovenia, was very successful in modernizing society, but it took place in a completely different context than the modernization prior in the West, because, as you know, in your countries, there is very little union power. The labor market was developed in a completely decentralized fashion after 1990, with all the problems that were involved. I think, nevertheless, it was economically successful, although we still have a gap in Europe. I sometimes call this the innovation gap. If you look at countries like Germany or Switzerland, or also Austria or Sweden, Denmark, you still see a greater potential for research and development to drive the economic machinery, and thus the countries having measured in macroeconomic terms higher productivities, higher wages, and thus still attract many workers from Central European countries. By and large, apart from this transformation, we observed globalization. What does globalization mean? Globalization is, of course, a very broad term, but in the sense I use it here, it means that due to the lowering of transportation costs and communication costs in the world economy, notably the walk into the information society, suddenly basically all workplaces had to do something with the digital economy. And that, of course, introduced what we economists in our language call a skill bias in the development. Because you had to be a little bit literate with these new techniques to get a decently paid job. And of course, young people, as you are much easier and have a much less difficulties to adjust to this new world than older and less skilled workers. So skill became ever more important. Now let's come to the present. In 2008, as you all know, and in the years after that, something very important happened: the world financial crisis. A very complex issue, which I don't go into here. We would still talk about it at 9 o'clock at night if we did, because it's highly complex. But in its effect on the labor market, it is clearly recognizable what happened. In those countries which had experienced a bubble, an unsustainable increase of wealth, if you like, and an unsustainable increase of the domestic economic activity, notably in the service sector. And that was the United States, that was Britain, that was also a lot of southern European countries, Portugal, Spain, Greece in particular, and some others in the east, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, also Hungary, partly also Slovenia, not quite so dramatic, but also Slovenia. That bubble burst, and the bubble will never come back. And that means that these jobs are gone. All the jobs which were connected with the service economy, which was not linked to innovative capacity in the industry of a country, were gone. You know, in London, these meant less financial market jobs. But in many other places, like Spain, for instance, it meant less jobs in tourism, less jobs in real estate, administration, and whatever. What we did get then was high youth unemployment in all these countries. And it is remarkable, and it must be kept in mind when we speak about the structural change of the world economy, that those countries who still had a viable industrial core, highly innovative, like Germany, Sweden, Denmark, Austria, they survived the crisis much less scarred than the others. So it turned out that to have an innovative capacity in industry proved to be a big advantage. By the way, I remember well in the last decade as an economist how the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris, a highly reputed organization, told us in Germany all the time that we should have more students and less people with a technical education. And we didn't really follow this advice. And it was good that we didn't follow the advice, because we today have the lowest youth unemployment, among the lowest youth unemployment rates in Europe, because we have a so-called apprenticeship system where people acquire technical skills while still going to school. We call it dual education. And that has proved to be excellent to give people skills that you need in this modern world. Not everybody is a big academic who can go to university and afterwards do something very abstract. So I think this is a very important recipe for all countries, that one should, when we say that the heyday of the industrial society is over, this does not mean that we don't need any technical education anymore. To the contrary, it means that we need a high-quality technical education which allows young people who are not going into academic professions to get good and well-paid jobs in the labor market and sustainable jobs. Okay? Now, that's roughly the situation we have today. We have, if I summarize, we live now in a world where industry has shrunk forever. We live in a world where we have recognized, finally, under pain, that living off bubbles is not possible. So what can we do? Let me then come very briefly to the policy challenges, and we may then go over briefly to discuss these. Well, I think there are some lessons from these decades of experience which are almost truisms, and there are also new lessons. The truism is good schooling. We need good schools. We need schools which give people, in particular, the motivation to learn for lifelong learning. It's not only the knowledge. You know, knowledge today is easily tappable via the internet. Go into Wikipedia, may not be everything correct in Wikipedia, but most of it is. And you can easily get knowledge, acquire knowledge, at a speed and an accuracy which former generations could never do in this short period of time. So schooling means that you have to make a selection of facts and knowledge. And that selection becomes ever more incomplete because the knowledge grows so fast. Okay? So, what is much more important is to inject in young people and older ones the motivation to mobilize their brains to tackle new questions, because the questions will always change, and in the world I have been describing, they will ever change ever faster. So it's more an enabling. This is what Ralph Dahrendorf had in mind when he talked in 1978 in one of his famous books about the opportunities, the chances in societies. He meant that you have to enable people individually. This is not a matter of, a big government injecting this into the people, but it's the groundwork of motivation that has to be done in schools on all levels. And with that, of course, I repeat, we have to get away from our academic arrogance that we think that only what is taught in higher schooling or in university is really knowledge and innovative knowledge. You know, I went through this hall and I saw how people work in the other room at their desktops. And it's obvious that with everybody searching for new combinations, for new ideas, and everybody adds a bit to the knowledge and the quality of what we can achieve. So the idea of research must be much broader than it was in the traditional industrial society and industrial firms where, let's say, in a chemical firm, we have chemical giants in Germany, a couple of them, and they had research labs which were completely separated from production. And that time is over. Research and development is becoming ever more intricately linked to the daily work. I'm sorry if I make a little excursion here, because my favorite branch, I mentioned it in our talk, Sebastian, already. My favorite example for this is always wine production. The vineyards, you're a wine-producing country as well, Slovenia. And I like wine, so it's a big topic for me. But how does a winemaker do research on his wine? Well, not in a laboratory, but in the vineyard. You know, he experiments with the conditions of climate, of soil, of everything. It's his own intuition to find out the combination of qualities that is optimal in terms of taste and ecology or whatever. And that is, I think, a picture of the new originality and creativity that we have developed that is extremely appealing, I think. It's an interesting, a nice world, a motivating world, and which is completely different from traditional industrial society where people, where research was completely separated from production. I can give you another point, another lesson of these decades of change that we face. The lesson is that the structure of work, the time structure and the team structure completely changes. In my youth, people started work at 6 o'clock in the morning or at 7 o'clock in the morning, and they together ended at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock. In Germany, we have a saying, a joke about the 5 o'clock mentality of people. You know, at 5 o'clock you drop everything, you go home, and then you have leisure. You have a complete separation between labor and leisure. This is not the case anymore today. If you take the issue of The Economist of this week, there is a note on the change of public transportation services in London. London is one of the most modern cities in the world in terms of its economic structure. And they found out that ever more people were taking night buses, not tourists, not people who had gone out for eating, but people, workers, if you like, intellectuals who had been, who take completely individualistic structure of their working time. and combine leisure and work in new ways. This is very important that we keep open in this respect, to open the door to this creativity. The second point is teamwork. You know, we are a generation in Europe which grows into a world of a massive demographic change. People get older. You mentioned your 93-year-old father, or grandfather, sorry. I'm terribly sorry. Grandfather, of course. You know, we are living in an aging society where ever more elderly people will have to do some work, because otherwise we will not be able to finance our retirement, old age pensions. And they must be motivated, and they can be motivated to do work in a flexible fashion. And you know, older people bring in experiences which youngsters don't have. They bring in what psychologists call a certain type of intelligence, not fluid intelligence, but more crystallized intelligence. A form of intelligence which is very much experience-based. And we need new team structures in the work of the future where older people bring in their experience and younger people their dynamics, originality. And you know, in Germany we begin now to do some research, a serious academic research on this, especially for the age group of 60 to 70-year-old people. And what we find out is that in general, people who work keep their cognitive abilities much more alive than those who go into early retirement. So it's not only a matter of financing the pensions, it's also a question of having a good, fruitful, and creative life to introduce flexibility into this system. Now, if you take all this, and I could go on with a lot of creative solutions, then of course, when I turn to liberalism, or the question of who decides what in society, it is quite obvious that in such a complex world, you cannot wait for the government to provide things for you. You have to take the initiative yourself. Okay, the government should not hinder you, especially the government should not put up huge bureaucratic hurdles if you want to open up a business or if you want to employ some people or whatever. It's a big problem in Germany. In Germany, we have a tendency to over-regulate everything, but we are not the worst in Europe, because I was just in Greece. And you know, the Greek people, you know that Greece is in a very, very difficult macroeconomic situation. And my answer to the problem is always, well, let the people use their creativity. That country has a very educated workforce. But as Greek people tell me all the time, you know, when you want to open up a business or employ another person, you have to fill in huge forms and go through a massive bureaucratic apparatus with a lot of corruption going on as well to get things done. So this cannot be the way. The way must be, into the future, must be that we allow the possibilities, the options of the information technology, of combining work in different ways in the freest form possible, and provide if possible, an appropriate infrastructure to make things work. I think this building, again, as Felicita told me, is a good example for this. It need not be much. You need a room, you may need a couple of notebooks or whatever, and you have to be linked to the communication network, and then you can start. So let me close with saying we have a huge common task in Europe in front of us. And by the way, we are sitting absolutely in the same boat. I don't like it all when people in Germany, for instance, look to Greece and say, oh, well, it's all very much different. No, we are living in one world and one Europe. And in this Europe, we will only be reasonably survive and prosper in the future in an aging society if we use our potential to the point that we are able to pay decent wages and to have a climate of economic activity which is far away from the, let's say, industrial capitalism where we come from. And let me finally say that, of course, the world as a whole does not stand still, which is good. Today, we have competitors. I have a chair for international economics, and that's, of course, my business of thinking about this. And if you look at the world as a whole, you see China, you see India, you see Indonesia, you see Brazil, you see many countries who grow into the international division of labor. And that's good, because, in India 40 years ago, we had famines. And today, there's not talk anymore of famines in India, but of sparkling new growth and economic options. But that means, of course, that good old Europe must find a different place in the world if it really wants to stay on top. It must be a thrilling place, a place of creativity, as I tried to describe it. And that is a common task where the European Union should support us, but not by pouring out massively subsidies as they have done in the past, and they have created bubbles by that, partly, but by looking very carefully where growth, creative growth, is emerging and what you can do to support that creative growth by a kind of positive climate and some facilities and infrastructure that is needed for that growth. Thank you very much for your patience. If there are questions to the talk immediately, I would stand ready to take them, if we have some time left.
Maybe one, maximum two, but otherwise, I guess you will be with us after the discussion panel, and that would be really great space for that. Is there any?
Yeah.
Okay.
I would just like to ask if I understood the talk correctly. You recommend sort of competition. That's really something you recommend us that we compete as much as we can with flexible work times and with innovativity. That also, like, I am from creative sphere, and it takes a lot of time and it also consumes a lot of energy to produce something creative. So it's just not something that's given or encouraged or there per se, but you have to make it. So, and in this way, your talk was somehow motivational towards the flexibility, not modern, but contemporary in ways of real dogfights, actually. That's how I understood. Did I understood it correctly?
I think so. It's let me say that what I'm describing is, of course, no easy honeymoon. It's hard work, but I think that this generation, the new generation, the young generation, knows that to create, in a sense, a better world and to live with these technologies and the new conditions we have, you have to work hard. But working hard is, I think, it's quite different to the kind of boring routine that was traditionally connected with classical industrial work. Please don't forget what was introduced in the United States by Ford, the assembly line, where every worker was standing at a big machine and making one movement of his hand or whatever. And that was really, had nothing to do with motivation for creative activity. And typically these people who did this work were completely exhausted when they turned 60. If they turned 60.
And also here, yes. But the other stuff that's going on here is really, really fast. It's just losing the social rights, like something our parents had, like social security and stuff. This is gone for new generations. We're just in for the struggle itself to compete with our parents, perhaps, or just others that are older than us on some job market. So that's something that's going on in my perspective at the moment. So there's sort of we don't get the same. So how do we keep some benefits they used to have? Because we are about to lose everything.
I don't think that, I don't quite think that you lose everything. First of all, please note that our societies, I'm not talking of Germany, but the discussion is exactly the same, will be shrinking. We will get a labor scarcity in a few years. You know, many people after the crisis think this is completely crazy when one thinks of labor scarcity, but we will get it. It's because a whole generation, the baby boomer generation, will leave the labor market. And so I think that if you look at wages, the wage development, there will be rises again in the coming. Labor will become more expensive. We observe this in Germany already. So the situation is not so statically determined as it looks like. But you're right. The problem, we will not go back to the traditional pensions. We cannot go back to the pillars of the traditional pension system, which was created with the idea of an ever-growing society of an industrial type. We need new methods of how to secure our old age pensions, and this will require new models, which is a far-reaching topic. Maybe we touch it tonight in the discussion. So, I mean, there is a downside to the development. I'm not preaching paradise here, but the downside is clearly that the degree of security that our parents had in this relatively stable world is gone.
Thank you very much. And I invite everybody else who has more questions and would like to talk more with Mr. Paque, that you join him in the third part of the conference.